In the last section of the lecture, I talked about some of the main contours of the rise of the US economy to prominence. In this section of the lecture, I'm going to talk about some of the main explanations for how the US came to have this position of prominence. We're going to be covering a long period of time and industry that evolved over time. So the coverage I'm going to give is going to be necessarily schematic. But I think I'm going to touch on most of the factors that are usually regarded as having been important at one point or another in the evolution of the US, rise of US industry. I'm going to talk about the US's evolution to be a mass production economy in two categories. First of all, by talking about the market, the demand for US industrial products, and then secondly, talking about the supply side. Beginning with the demand side, the market, I think there's four sort of factors that you can potentially think of as being important determinants of the US being a mass production economy. First of all, as we talked about in the last section of the lecture, the US had a geography which meant that it was able to produce food for a large population. So the US had a relatively large population to which producers could supply goods and services. Secondly, that increasingly became an integrated local market. So improved roads, improved canals, for example, the development of the Erie Canal, and railways meant that the cost of transporting goods between different points in the US decreased substantially. So, for example, a recent study by David Donaldson and Richard Hornbeck estimates that if you'd removed railways from the United States at the end of the 19th century, it would have lowered gross national product by over 6%. So basically the lack of capacity to sell on a large scale, the consequences of that in terms of businesses' ability to specialize and produce on a large scale accounted for a sort of substantial amount of what the US was able to produce by the end of the 19th century. A third factor that's sometimes raised is a demand for standardized products. So the mass production economy involved producing relatively standardized commodity type consumer products. And it's sometimes argued that the US was willing to buy those type of products, whereas by comparison the United Kingdom, which at some points in the 19th century had a similar size of population to the US, so you could ask, well, why didn't the UK become a mass production economy? Here the argument is it's because there was different type of consumer preferences, that consumers in the US perhaps were more willing to consume this standardized type of product. The other aspect of the market is international competition. There is a long-standing debate about whether tariff protection given to US manufacturers, especially in the early part of the 19th century, was important in their development. More generally, when we think about international competition, there's the idea that the US, of course, increasingly was exporting its manufactured output to the rest of the world. And so the kind of factors that we talked about previously in this lecture, in the first year of globalization, lower transport costs, for example, increasing income, were factors as well that contributed to the US being able to sell to a larger market, in that case internationally. So here I've just got a table that makes the point about the relatively rapid growth of US population during this period, creating a market for mass market for consumer goods, but also the important role that immigration played in the increase in population that created this mass market. So in the right-hand column here, I've got the share of the increase in population in the previous decade that was due to immigration, and it's never less than 25%, and sometimes up to 50% during this period. So population size, partly fostered by immigration was an important part of creating a mass market. Here's a perspective on transport costs from a study that sort of attempted to give a feel for average transport costs per mile at the beginning and in the middle of the 19th century. And you can see the sort of substantial cost falls that occurred. So, decrease of half in the price of transporting goods by road, a significant decrease in the cost per mile of transporting by river with the shift to steamboats, and also a big decrease in the cost of shipping goods by sea. The second approach I want to take to talking about the rise of the US as a mass production economy is to talk about the supply side. So factors that contributed on the supply side to promoting the development of the US as a mass production economy. And I've organised that discussion in terms of technological change, organising production, natural resources, education, finance, and competition in business. And so I'm going to work through the factors in that order. So first of all, technological developments. So the period from sort of the mid-19th century through to the mid-20th century was a period where there was a large number of new technological developments, inventions, which came out of the United States. So in the mid to late 19th century, there was a diversity of new types of machines, things like Bonsack's cigarette making machine, the typewriter. There were new production processes, so disassembly process for meat carcasses, new processes, the Goodyear process for producing shoes, for example, and there were new distribution facilities which are created. So, for example, the steel tankers for transporting petroleum, or the refrigerated cars for transporting meat. So there was a variety of sort of technological developments in the mid to late 19th century that increased the capacity to produce on a large scale, but also increased the capacity to distribute on a large scale. In the early 20th century, the US, through technological developments, develops a comparative advantage in newer industries such as agriculture, industrial equipment, producing cars and aircraft, and also resource-intensive sectors such as non-ferrous metal production. In the mid-19th up to sort of the end of the 19th century, a lot of importance is also usually attached to the development of an autonomous machine tool production industry in the US. So this was an industry that basically produced machine tools that would be used in other industries. And so the development of this industry came about through, increasing demand for machinery by industry, but also through the sort of convergence in the types of machines that these other industries in manufacturing industry were wanting to do. So standardization of processes like drilling and milling, for example, meant that you could have a machine tool industry which produced machines and sold the same type of machine to different industry sectors. And so this industry itself then became a source of sort of technological improvement in the machines that were being used by other industries. And there are often feedbacks, for example, between the machine tool industry enabling developments in the mass production of motor vehicles, assembly line production, and then through the processes there, feedbacks to improvement in the types of machines that were being developed in the machine tool industry. Another important aspect of the period from the late 19th through to the 20th century was the role of electrification. So electricity was increasingly used as a source of power in industry. That enabled an increase in flexibility in factory organisation. So whereas with water power and then steam power, you tended to have sort of belt drive systems, meaning that or a single sort of power generating plant that would then drive a belt drive system, which meant that you had to have machines organized in a particular sort of way. With electricity, with the flexibility to sort of locate the outlet of power in a whole variety of places, it increased flexibility in the way that machinery could be located, again facilitating the adoption of new sort of assembly line type processes. Here's a table that tells you about the changing sources of power in the US. So in 1870, it was about 50-50 water and steam. At the end of the 19th century, it evolved to be predominantly steam. But then during the first 30 years of the 20th century, you can see that it rapidly evolves to be predominantly the case that it's electricity that's the main power source for mechanical driving industry in the US. The second factor contributing to mass production on the supply side is the organisation of production. So basically the US, and this is something which has been I guess most in the most well-known versions told by the US business historian Alfred Chandler, the US developed new ways for organising production. So they had large-size firms. Those large-size firms meant that you had to introduce management. So there was this new activity of management which was created within US-style organisations, and the large-style firms meant that new systems of communication and control within organisations had to be developed. This was facilitated by new office technologies. So we had new technologies for example, recording information, typewriters, new technologies for storing information, new technologies for processing data. So the productivity of white-collar managerial type workers was increased by these new office technologies, and that fed into being able to have larger scale organisations where the management could control a larger size of workforce. So this is an example sort of from Chandler of the type of hierarchical sort of large-scale organisation that initially developed in the US, where you'd have top management, who were supervising middle management, supervising lower management, and so on, but then eventually sort of evolving to what's called the multi-divisional structure, where you have sort of here different activities, films or chemicals that are being done by a firm, and each of those is divided into a different division with their own accounting, R&D and sales sections. And then up here you have sort of general divisions, so advisory staff, legal, personnel, purchasing, and a section that would be in charge of the financial activities of the firm. So this second point is the idea that to be a mass production economy, you needed a new type of firm. And the US evolved ways of organising these new large-scale firms that made them successful. The third factor is the US is a minerals-dominant economy. And so in the late 19th century, the US became a world leader in coal production as well as in production in copper, petroleum, iron ore, zinc, phosphate, lead, and other minerals. Why was that the case? I mean, nowadays we know that the US is not actually, by comparison with other countries of similar land size and that, an especially resource-rich country. But at the time, it was a leader in producing a lot of these minerals. And I guess that's generally regarded as having been due to favourable US institutions, which provided strong incentives for exploration for minerals, which had the US Geological Survey Office providing sort of public information on the geology of the US, and also which established sort of colleges of mining engineers to provide the workforce for mining. Now, resource abundance is usually regarded as having been an important fact in US development, because resources were really important as an input to a whole lot of the mass production goods which the US ended up producing. So iron and steel, machinery, automobile and parts are all natural resource intensive. They need coal, they need as a source of power, they need iron ore to produce them. So if the US was going to be a mass production economy in the type of heavy industry goods that you would usually expect an industrial economy to evolve to produce at some stage, then it needed these natural resources, and it had them. So here I've got a graph that shows the US mineral output as a percentage of the world total in 1913. So you can see in 1913 the US was producing over 90% of the world's natural gas, 2/3 of the world's petroleum, over half of the world's copper, about half of the world's phosphate, about 40% of the world's coal, and so on. So around the turn of the 20th century, the US was a dominant industrial producer. And because of the transport costs of producing, of shipping these type of goods to these natural resources to other parts of the world, it meant that economically the most efficient way to produce iron and steel from the iron ore was to produce it in the US. It wasn't to put the iron ore on boats and send it to England to have it produced as iron ore there. The transport costs in the early 20th, late 19th century meant that the most efficient way to produce iron and steel out of the US iron ore was to do it in America. So first, the US has a large supply of these natural resources. Secondly, your transport costs mean that the natural place to produce the final product out of these natural resources was in the US. And so that combination means the US is able to be a mass producer of heavy industry type goods. And this next graph makes the point that, yeah, producing these heavy industry goods was really important in the rise of US industry, sort of. So this is the share of US manufacturing exports accounted for by automobiles, so rising from 0 in 1900 up to about 15% in 1929, machinery, and iron and steel. And here's the total, rising from 5% in 1879 up to about almost 40% in 1929. So this is saying, look, these natural resource intensive goods were really important part of the story about the US becoming a successful industrial economy. Fourth dimension on the supply side is the role of education. So the US is a world leader in mass education. They're ahead of the rest of the world in achieving mass high school education from 1910 to 40. They're ahead of the rest of the world in achieving mass higher education in the years around 1940 to 50. So education attainment increases in the US by about 5.5 years from the late 19th century to the 1970s. Why is this important? Well, for a variety of reasons. First of all, it seems that in the industrialization that was happening around the time that mass high school education was occurring, there are important complementarities in production of those goods between more educated blue-collar workers and the type of activities that workers required to perform in those industries. So, for example, with the sort of machinery that was being used in automobile production, iron and steel production, and that, you needed people who could read manuals. So you needed people who were literate. You needed people who had some understanding about sort of the way electricity worked, sometimes about properties of chemicals and that. So it seems like a more educated high school workforce was important part of the rise of the type of US industries which were important in the early 20th century. Secondly, with the rise of the large-scale size firm in the US and the increasing demand for white-collar management employees, and also in the 20th century the increasing rise of service industries, providing professional services like accounting services, for example, there's an increasing demand for more highly educated workers to do those management jobs, to do those service industry jobs. And so the US has a larger group of workers than anywhere else, potential workers, who have the education to do those jobs. Eventually, the US also is ahead of the rest of the world because of its earlier mass higher education in producing engineers and scientists. And so that gives the US an advantage in doing R&D in more complex areas like electronics and chemicals sort of later on in the 20th century. So for a variety of reasons, having a highly educated workforce seems to have been important in underpinning the rise of US industry. And here's a graph which just sort of shows the increase in high school, the overall school enrolment rate of 5 to 19-year-olds. So you can see it was about 50% from 1850 to 1900, but then really takes off from 1900, and so by 1960 it's increased up to about 90%. Starting from an earlier phase than other countries, a rise in the proportion of the US population who are relatively highly educated. This is a table that just tries to give a perspective on the effect of that, on economic growth. So here's for some sub-periods in the 20th century, the rate of growth in labour productivity, 2.45, 2.92, 2.41. This is the growth in efficiency units of labour, so the growth in labour input due to growth in education. And this tells you then how much of the labour productivity growth we can think of as being explained by education. And you can see that it's always about 10 to 20%. So a relatively large proportion of the growth in labour productivity can be directly explained by the growth in education. Of course, the effect of education could have been larger to the extent that having a more educated workforce allowed firms to bring in particular types of capital equipment that workforce could use. The next factor I want to talk about is the role of finance. So this quote from Peter Rousseau and Richard Siller says, "Good finance is central to mobilising capital and applying it to its most productive uses, as well as to reducing informational asymmetries between savers, investors and entrepreneurs." So a financial system is important in linking up effectively borrowers and lenders, and it's important for sort of working out what the best, as a sorting device for working out what the best uses of capital are. While the US, as with other countries in the world, certainly didn't have a perfect banking system, it does seem like the state banking system that evolved in the first part of the 20th century, the national bank system that evolved after the 1860s, the Federal Reserve, or the introduction of the Federal Reserve System in the early 20th century, following the crash of 1907, have all been sort of important parts of providing a financial underpinning to US industry. So for example, in the first part of the 19th century, it does seem that increases in monetisation in the US, increases in available financial instruments seem to have preceded economic development. In the period after the National Bank Act, it seems like it was in the areas where national banks were located that manufacturing industry was likely to locate. In other words, access to capital seems to have been an important driver of economic development. And this just gives you a perspective on, for example, that second point I mentioned, the growth of banks in the national banking era, where you get sort of this increase in national banks being seen to provide sort of a more stable source of funds than the state banks had, and feeding into manufacturing development during this period. Another theme I wanted to talk about is business and competition. So as the US began to industrialise, sort of a tension between competition and collusion or cooperation between business people started to develop. And a great example probably is Cornelius Vanderbilt, who started out as a steamboat proprietor in the mid-19th century and then eventually sort of became a railway magnate as well. And T.J. Stiles, in his book The First Tycoon, has a really nice quote, I think, where he says, "No body of men could have better exemplified the ironies of the American economy in the 1830s and 40s. Steamboat proprietors were famous for their competitiveness, symbols of a hotly individualistic society in which hatred of monopoly was a pillar of politics. On the other hand, though, perhaps no other businessman had worked to construct mechanisms to limit or even eliminate competition. They made agreements to divide up routes, split profits, and punish those who violated their unwritten code. The business culture they created demonstrates how the impulse to stifle competition arose inseparably from competition itself in the American economy." So this tension between competition and attempts to stifle competition is sort of an ever-present theme in the US economy as US industry begins to develop. And so here's sort of a cartoon from the time when Vanderbilt was important in railways. He controlled the Hudson River Railroad and the New York Central Railroad and was wanting to take over the Erie Railroad so that he could control all the railroads in New York, and ran up against someone called James Fisk, who sort of opposed him having that monopoly. Now, in the later part of the 19th century, the main way that concentration of industry developed was initially through trust and holding companies, which were arrangements where independent sort of supposedly independent companies came together to have their assets jointly held in a way that they could then act cooperatively. So the Standard Oil Trust, probably most famous example. Then after those trusts are sort of ruled illegal by the Sherman Act, then you get a merger wave of sort of the 1890s. Initially sort of horizontal mergers between different businesses doing the same activity, but then eventually vertical mergers where steel companies like Carnegie Company and Federal Steel Company, which eventually merged to become US Steel in 1901, vertically integrate. So they start, as well as producing steel and iron ore, they're also producing the inputs, the coal, which they need for their foundries, and they're also then taking the iron and steel and producing finished products with that iron and steel to sell into wholesale or retail markets for that iron and steel. So in a variety of ways, US industry is sort of becoming more concentrated in the late 19th century. And so that becomes a major public policy issue. The government attempts to regulate competitions through the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Supreme Court initially sort of stymies those attempts at a regulation, and they're able to be sort of, I guess, avoided by merging rather than creating trusts. But by the early 20th century, 1909 to 11, popular sentiment is really sort of changing against mergers and monopolies, and so in the end you get the breakup, for example, of the Standard Oil Company as a desire for greater competition becomes more important in the US economy. There are two other themes of the US economy about this period that I just wanted to mention quickly. One is that the US is involved in two major sort of wars during the period we're talking about. The first is the Civil War. The Civil War was a hugely disruptive effect on the US economy, particularly the South. So you can see here that this is basically saying that the cost of the Civil War in the period when the Civil War were occurring in the South were about 50% of per capita consumption during this period. For the total US economy, 25% sort of at a peak. And the effects are long-lasting sort of. There's long-lasting effects of the Civil War on the performance of the US economy. So this is important in two respects. One, to make the point that, look, there was this hugely disruptive event in the US history, in the US economy. It also makes the point sort of how, I guess, successful the US economy was, that it really overcame this huge disruption to still get to the position of being the world's largest industrial producer. The other war, or wars that I want to mention, probably were more a positive for the US economy. So World War I, main theatre of war in Europe, the US sort of initially is neutral, enters that war late. World War II, also the US somewhat delayed in entering. Especially in World War I, the wartime activity of the European powers means that they have to turn to the US as a major supplier of foodstuffs and capital goods. And as well, there have been markets that European producers had been supplying, for example, in South America, that they no longer supply. And so the US is able to take over those markets. Even though, as we'll see when we talk about World War in the next lecture, that World War certainly had some negative direct effect on the US economy, the US also sort of relative to countries in Europe wasn't disadvantaged as much by this wartime activity. And so you can see that 1913 to 1950, the US economy grows a lot more than for example, the UK, France and Japan, who are more involved in war, and also the US productivity per employee is much stronger than in those other areas. Now, partly that's just continuing on the fact of the US's industrial rise, shown in the fact that it had higher GDP growth and productivity growth than, for example, the UK in the previous period. But you can see, and this will be an important theme in a couple of lectures' time, that after this period of war finishes, other countries such as Japan and France, they do start to catch up to the US when this disruption of war finishes. So it's important sort of to keep in mind these events of the war when interpreting sort of the evolution of US economic performance. The other point I just wanted to make is that, as with other developed economies, we're increasingly realising the environmental costs of economic development. So this is a picture of the US Dust Bowl episode from the 1930s. In the American plains, increasingly agriculture, land in the plains was being taken up for agriculture, native grasslands were replaced with crops. In the 1930s there's a whole lot of crop failures, which mean that the soil's basically exposed, and there's huge sort of windstorms which then end up significantly sort of reducing the amount of topsoil and the quality of the soil in this Dust Bowl area, with long-term implications for US agriculture. And that's a story that's recently been told by Richard Hornbeck in an analysis of this episode. Another example in a piece of research by Scott Taylor is about the buffalo. So in the 16th century there were 25 to 30 million buffalo in the US, but by the late 19th century there was only 100 left. And Taylor shows how most of that reduction in the number of buffalo occurred within basically 10 years. And it occurred on the basis of, first of all, a technological innovation that allowed buffalo hides to be turned into leather. In Europe at that time there was a huge amount of demand for leather, for footwear for example, which meant that basically buffalo could be slaughtered and leather could be created from their hides, and the price never fell because there was such a big demand in Europe. And also, basically, there was open access rights to this land. There was no government regulation at the time of the buffalo. So important to sort of think about these environmental costs of economic development as well. In the next section of this lecture, I'm going to move on to talk about sort of one particular aspect of the rise of industry at this time, what was happening to labour.